Appalachian Genealogy and History presents America's First Secession, the Lost State of Franklin. In 1784, frontier settlers west of the Appalachian Mountains attempted something unprecedented in American history. Believing the government in the East had abandoned them, they organized their own state and called it Franklin. The experiment survived for roughly 4 years without ever gaining federal recognition, but the paperwork it generated still complicates genealogical research in the region today. This is the story of America's first secession. To understand why Franklin happened, you have to understand what the Trans-Appalachian West actually looked like in the 1780s. It was not empty frontier. The Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Shawnee nations were actively contesting boundaries, negotiating survival, and pushing back against relentless encroachment. Spain controlled the Mississippi River and the Gulf Coast, using both as leverage against the young American Republic. And from Virginia and North Carolina, settlers were pushing west at a pace the new federal government could not manage, driven by land hunger, debt, and the belief that natural rights meant the right to go wherever you could hold ground. All three forces were colliding in the same narrow corridor at the same time. That collision is where Franklin was born. In April 1784, the North Carolina legislature voted to cede its western lands to the Confederation Congress. The state was drowning in Revolutionary War debt, and the land was the one asset it had in abundance. But the settlers already living on that land found out what had happened before Congress ever acted. They were, in a single legislative stroke, cut loose from the only government they had. Then, before Congress could respond, North Carolina's voters turned out the legislators responsible, and the new assembly repealed the secession that autumn. For the settlers of Washington, Sullivan, and Greene counties, this was the final provocation. They had been handed over and then reclaimed like a piece of property. In August 1784, they declared independence. The men who built Franklin moved fast. John Seaver was elected governor, David Campbell took the bench as judge, and Jonesboro became the first capital before the seat later shifted to Greenville. Courts went up, new counties were organized, land warrants started flowing, and negotiations opened with the indigenous nations. Hard currency was nearly impossible to come by on the frontier, so the founders did something practical and memorable. They wrote barter straight into law. Taxes and official salaries could be paid in deerskins, beaver pelts, bacon, tobacco, and whiskey. By November 1785, the North Carolina Constitution had been adopted with modifications, and the new republic was formally named Franklin. An unsuccessful pitch for Benjamin Franklin's support in Congress. It was an audacious thing to build. It was also, from the start, fragile. Franklin was not simply fighting one enemy. It was caught in a four-way contest for control of the same territory. Franklin wanted statehood and land. North Carolina wanted legal jurisdiction and tax revenue. And the indigenous nations, most immediately the Cherokee and Chickamauga, were fighting to stop settler expansion that had been violating treaty after treaty for years. And Spain, controlling the Mississippi River, was quietly offering navigation rights and protections to anyone willing to align with Madrid rather than Philadelphia. Each of these four powers had real leverage, and at various points, each of them threatened to end Franklin outright. Even inside Franklin, the ground was splitting. John Seaver was charismatic, battle-tested, and committed to full independence. His base was the yeoman farmers and frontier militias who had trusted him for years of fighting alongside them. John Tipton had actually been a Franklin delegate before turning against the movement. He believed that separation from North Carolina could cost settlers their legal land titles, and he was not wrong to worry about it. By the mid-1780s, two governments were operating simultaneously across the same counties, two sets of courts, two sets of sheriffs, two sets of tax collectors, all trying to govern the same people. The rivalry between Seaver and Tipton was personal and bitter, and it would eventually come to blows. By 1787 and into 1788, Franklin was being squeezed from every direction. Congress had refused statehood and showed no signs of changing course. North Carolina was deploying rival sheriffs and levying taxes the Franklinites refused to pay, while Spain kept the Mississippi River closed and strangled the frontier trade the region depended on to survive. And in June of 1788, the murder of the Cherokee chief Corntassel, killed by militia members during what was supposed to be a diplomatic meeting, ended any hope of stability on the southern frontier. The Cherokee response was immediate and devastating. Franklin was running out of time, running out of allies, and running out of room. The end came fast. In early February 1788, North Carolina's sheriff for Washington County, acting on orders from John Tipton, seized several of John Seaver's slaves as payment for taxes owed to North Carolina. Seaver was furious. He gathered roughly 150 militia and marched to Tipton's farm, surrounding the cabin and demanding his slaves back. Tipton refused. Gunfire was exchanged, but over 2 days, Sullivan County reinforcements loyal to North Carolina arrived through the snow and routed Seaver's forces. 2 of Seaver's sons were captured. Tipton threatened to hang them before being talked down by his own men. The Battle of Franklin, the only military engagement in the lost state's history, was over. So, for all practical purposes, was Franklin. Desperate and cornered, Seaver made one last move. In the summer of 1788, he opened secret negotiations with the Spanish minister to the United States. He wrote asking for Spanish protection, loans, and military aid, dangling the possibility that Franklin, or what remained of it, might align with Madrid rather than the American Republic. The implications alarmed the federal government. If Spain could pull Western settlers out of the American orbit by offering the one thing Congress kept refusing, access to the Mississippi River and a functioning economy, the entire Trans-Appalachian West was at risk. The negotiations went nowhere, but they demonstrated just how far a frontier people would go when their government ignored them long enough. In October 1788, John Seaver was arrested for treason in Jonesboro and jailed in Morgantown, North Carolina. His own followers helped him escape. In February 1789, the leaders of Franklin swore allegiance to North Carolina, and the state that they had built simply ceased to exist. North Carolina then permanently ceded its western lands to the federal government. In 1790, the Southwest Territory was formally organized. 6 years later, in 1796, Tennessee was admitted as the 16th state of the Union. John Seaver was elected its first governor. The men who built the illegal state of Franklin did not win statehood. They won something harder to measure. They proved the Trans-Appalachian West was not to be ignored, and they forced the federal government to build a structured path for everything that came after. Here is where history becomes genealogy. 4 years of overlapping jurisdictions meant 4 years of conflicting documents. A land warrant issued by a Franklin official might later be repatented by North Carolina and then recorded a third time in a Tennessee county deed book. Probate inventories started under Franklin administrators, sometimes had to be finished under North Carolina courts. Tax lists show gaps where settlers simply refused to pay either government. And because Appalachian clerks wrote what they heard, phonetic spelling variations and local landmark descriptions make the same family appear under different names in different repositories. When you find your ancestor in the 1780s in this part of the country, you are not looking at one layer of a record, you are looking at 3. Think of it as 3 sedimentary layers laid down over the same ground. At the bottom is the Franklin warrant, issued between 1784 and 1788 by de facto officials, often recorded phonetically, often pointing to landmarks that no longer exist. Above it is the North Carolina patent, issued after Franklin's collapse, sometimes carrying a marginal note in the deed book that explains why the original warrant had to be revalidated. And at the top is the Tennessee deed, recorded after statehood in 1796, which looks clean and final but obscures everything beneath it. A researcher who starts with that Tennessee deed and stops there only has 1/3 of the story. You have to work backwards through all 3 layers, across repositories in at least 2 states, before the chain of title is complete. Franklin failed. The men who built it never got the vote they needed, but the 4-year experiment they ran left permanent marks on American history. It helped produce the provision in the Article 4 of the Constitution that governs how new states can be formed. It demonstrated plainly that Western settlers would build their own institutions if the federal government refused to build them, and it left behind a permanent, overlapping documentary record that is still one of the most challenging and rewarding archives in Appalachian genealogy. The rebellion failed, but the ground it fought on became Tennessee, and the records it left behind are still waiting to tell you where your family stood. Thank you for joining us today. Please remember to join us over at AppalachianGenealogy.com for more history from the mountains.